Okay, so we want to update the last active date whenever a user carries out some kind of activity in our application. And we have a tool to help us with that in .NET called an action filter. So let's take a look at what these are. And if I was, for example, to go to my user's controller, then inside our API controller we have effectively actions. Each one of these is an action. And an action filter would actually let us carry out an action before the action is executed at this stage, or it would allow us to carry out an action after the action has been executed. And we can set our action filter as an attribute, so we could set our action filter to take place here, and then it would be available for all of our actions inside this controller. Or the way that we're going to use it is we're going to use it in our base API controller, and therefore all of our derived controllers. So when a user carries out any action that involves interacting with one of our API controller endpoints, we're going to update their last active property. So let's go and configure this. And inside Solution Explorer, inside the helpers folder, let's create a new file, and it's going to be a class, and we'll call it log user activity. And inside this file, we're going to use the iAsync action filter interface, and this has a required method, so we'll go ahead and implement the interface, and this creates our on-action execution async. So we've got access to our context, and from here we can get access to the HTTP context. And we've also got our action execution delegate called next, and we'll execute this function, and anything that we do before this function happens before our action is executed, and anything that we do after we execute this function is going to happen after the action has been executed. So that's the idea. So let's make this an async task, and inside here let's remove the throw new exception, and we'll say var results context equals next, or await next. So at this stage our action in the API controller is going to be executed, and the action filter gives us a chance to do something after that's happened. So if we wanted to do something before that happened, then we could do it right here before we execute next, but anything that we execute after this point is going to be happening after the action has been executed. So that's a good place to do something like what we're about to do. But first of all, we'll check to make sure the user is authenticated, as if they are not, there's very little point in us continuing further because we need to update a user property. So we're going to say if context.http/context.user.identity, and we're going to check the is authenticated property, and we'll need to use the optional chaining there, and say not equal to true, then we are going to return. And we're not going to execute any further functionality inside here. And then we'll get hold of the username, so we'll say var username equals, and the result context is effectively going to give us the same as the context at this point. So we can use our result context and say http context.user and get user name. So we've got all the same functionality that we'd have in an API controller inside here. And then we'll need to get hold of our repository, as we're going to need to update a user property. So we're going to say var repo equals, and we're going to say result context.http context, and then we can use request services, and this method gets or sets the service provider that provides access to the requests service container, and we're going to use get required service, and we want to get hold of the iUser repository and add the parentheses there. And then we want to get hold of our user, so we're going to say var user equals await and repo, and we're going to use our get user by username async and pass in the username. And we're going to check to see if the user is equal to null, and if so, we're just going to return and once again break out of this execution of this function. And then if we do have the user, we're going to say user.lastActive equals date time, and we're going to use UTC now. And then we'll say await repo and save all async. Now we're going to use this as a service that is scoped to the HTTP request, because that's effectively how we're using it. It's an action filter, so it happens with actions, and they are scoped to the HTTP request. So we're going to open up our application service extensions, and inside here I'll say services and add scoped, and inside here we're going to say log user activity. Now, in order to make use of this, we're going to go to our base API controller, and inside here we're going to, in square brackets, we're going to say service filter, and then we say type of, and then we can pass in our log user activity. And that's that. Now what should happen, and in fact I'm going to check the status of the API. Okay, it's telling us to restart. So what should happen now is anytime that we call an API request, the user that's logged in, they're going to have their last active property updated. So let's head over to Postman and test this. So let's close these couple of tabs down. Now the simple action of logging in as a user should update that last active property. So I'm going to send this and get the token for Lisa. And then if I go and get Lisa's user by username, and again doing this would also update that property as well. So inside section 12 I've got to get user by username. Let's click send on this. And what we want to see is the last active property for Lisa being updated, but I do not. That is the same as what it was before, and it's certainly not 2020 from my perspective. So something didn't work, and what could that be? That's interesting. It says we're updating there inside the logs, so it certainly looks like it should have been updated. Let's try sending that request again. Get user by username, click send, and sure, okay. So not quite sure what happened with that first request, but now we can see that is being updated. And if I send this request again, we should see a difference in the timestamp there between what it says there, 043500.19507. If I click send again, then we can see that's being updated. So each time we send this, we're updating our last active property, which is great. But are we being optimal with what we're doing here? Let's just clear the window so we've got a clear terminal, and I'll just execute that request one more time. And let's go and take a look at the query. Let's go into the database. So this is the update. This is what's happening once we've got the user and we're setting the last active, and that's fine. But this query here, what we've got going on before we get to the update is the user. Is this as optimal as it could be? Well, not really, because we're getting the user by username, which is also including the photos there. We can see that in the request as well. We've got a left join to the photos, and that's not as optimal as it could be for something that we're going to carry out so frequently as updating a last active property. So in the next lesson, we'll take a look at this and see what we can do to make it a bit more optimal.